No, not that Atlassian, the other Atlassian. IT Atlassian.
So if you want to download and start installing SQL Server, you can. You don't have to do it right now. You're probably not going to have it up and running and configured by the end of class. If you're just starting now, you may or you may not. So you may want to just work on a lab machine for today. Okay, it's already installed there. So he did talk about some of the other reasons. What else did you get? Anything out of that video about why we might use SQL Server? What are some of the benefits?
Well, we're working with C#, so that's Microsoft Studio, so it's going to integrate nicely.
Yep, so it typically integrates very well. So there are different drivers. There's different ways for .NET applications to connect to different databases, but it will perform the best with SQL Server because it has native built-in drivers that Microsoft wrote. So that's one good reason. It plays really nicely with ASP.NET.
Reporting software.
Yeah, it's got tools, built-in tools like reporting tools, so we can generate reports right out of SQL Server if we want.
What exactly are reports for? It's like what type of information do they want?
Could be anything. So basically you can run a database query and it has tools to just basically generate a report. You can write an SQL query and export it to a report.
When we are working, do businesses provide this to you? It's so expensive if we're doing contract work. Like, do we have this on our own?
It's a very good question. Now, that has to do with, he mentioned hosting, which was one of the other benefits of using SQL Server, sort of related to your question. What did he say about hosting? If we think about the license cost, right, that many hosting companies will offer to rent you space on their SQL server. So if you want to run your database, most hosting companies basically only give you two choices if you're renting space. They'll give you MySQL or they'll give you SQL Server. Okay? So if you want to host a site with a third party, most of them, the hosts pay these kinds of licensing costs. And they just charge you monthly to host. You know, they charge you 10, 20, 30 bucks a month to host the website as well as the database. You cannot find other enterprise level databases on shared hosting. So if you wanted to use something like Oracle, you're going to have to run your own server and pay the licensing cost for Oracle. Whereas SQL Server, most hosts will offer. Any host that offers Windows hosting will also offer SQL Server. So they're paying the license cost and you're just paying a monthly hosting fee for it. Now, to develop, technically, yes, you do need your own SQL Server license to do development. But they give you this, right? You can get it for $38. You get the developer version that allows you to basically build and test. What it doesn't come with is the full server, so you couldn't actually use the developer version to host the real world application. But it's relatively cheap. You can get that kind of, pay that kind of cost and get a developer version, which is sufficient for a class, right? Because we're not actually hosting. We don't need all the security and other services that come with it just for doing development. You know, the company that we host with, they'll pay for that kind of license and it will include all of those things.
On the lab computer, there's SQL Server configuration, error, usage, and installation.
It's under SQL Server 2008 R2.
Oh, R2.
Yeah, it's the R2, which is an update. It was a major update.
If you go under all programs in computer studies.
Yeah, it's in computer studies, SQL Server 2008 R2 in there.
Microsoft SQL.
Sorry, Microsoft SQL Server 2008 R2 under
And you
computer
just want the
studies.
management studio from there?
Yeah. So he also pointed out all of these other programs. There's actually a lot of money to be made in database administration. Somebody who is an SQL Server DBA is easily making close to $100,000 a year, if not over. Okay. When you think about the importance of all of this stuff, in an organization, you know, think about somebody like at Georgian, think of how many databases they have running here and how many systems depend on those databases, as he said, being online, that the data is not corrupted, that it's backed up properly, that it can be accessed quickly, that it's secured. Like, there's an awful lot of responsibility on the people, because all of the applications that the application developers and designers build, they all sit on top, right? Without the data, those applications really are useless. So people are very well paid to make sure that that data is reliable, it's robust, and it's secure.
It's pretty much all useless without that data, right? Like,
That's
open websites or anything.
That's right. So you don't need as many database administrators as you do developers, but all the developers and designers' jobs basically depend on the DBAs being able to do their jobs properly.
Will we, like, cover everything? Like, is there more programs out there that just specifically target the database administrator, like, type stuff, or is it kind of a self-learn?
Yeah, I mean, we're not really training you to be a database administrator. We're more giving you database tools so that you can be an application developer, really. But there are people who have graduated from the program who found this is really where their interest and their strength lied, and they did additional training, they've done certifications, and this is what they're doing. So, and certainly you get enough of a background, right? Because we're going to play with SQL Server in this course. And then in January, in your last course with me, we're actually going to play around with NoSQL databases, which is something completely different. So we'll play around and we'll use MongoDB, which is a non-relational database. So you'll get exposure. By the time you graduate, you will have played with MySQL, you will have used SQL Server, and you also will have used MongoDB in a NoSQL. So at least you'll have a foundation if you wanted to move into doing other things. Also times other people, maybe they start as application developers, they might go out and work for years as a developer and figure it's time for a change. I've worked with databases enough now, I know enough about them, now I'm going to go do an SQL Server and Oracle certification, and I'm going to switch streams and become a database administrator and do something different. Michelle, did you have a question?
Is there any benefit to using a SQL server rather than running your own server in a company? Like, if you run a company and you have your own server to host your data, is there a benefit that?
You mean as opposed to using shared hosting?
Other than the fact you're not responsible for it.
That's a great question. So, you know, we need SQL Server. Should we have our own in-house servers, or should we just rent space on a hosting company? There's pros and cons to both. Anybody have an opinion? What would be some of the reasons to run your own servers in-house, and what would be some of the reasons to outsource it and host those databases elsewhere? Kenzie?
Can you use different languages?
Yes, that's true, although you could do that in either case. The application languages wouldn't matter. But Michelle, I think, was talking about, we need a bunch of applications. We know we want to use SQL Server to host them. Should we have our own server in our company office to run them? Or should we just host those on a hosting provider?
I think it just depends on, like, where you're at with your business. Like, if it's a major, huge company and they're constantly using the databases and stuff like that, and they can afford to put the time and investment into their own server, it's probably a little bit, like, they can take the measures to make it secure. You're not relying on someone else to make sure that that's secure. But if you're a startup company and you don't have the funds to do it, then obviously hosting until you can become bigger, make something, seems to be.
Very good points.
I was going to say, like, version control. You're not reliant on what version of software they have running on their computer, and as well as security. Like, say they have, like, some security breach internal, and I heard this happening a couple of times with huge companies where they're making thousands of dollars a day, and then at the hosting company, somebody gets really smart, and they go, oh, I'm gonna go into here and do a little bit this, and then it's like a disaster. So you're not risking that when it's in your basement or whatever.
Yeah, it's the difference of owning it rather than renting it, so to speak. You have more control over it because you own it.
Right.
Down to, can you upkeep a server in your office. Everyone would love to have a server in their office, but is it worth it?
Yeah, it largely comes down to really cost. So cost and security are really the big issues. Also, you're going to have better performance, right? If our server's in the next room, connecting to it and our applications talking to it is going to be much faster than if we have to connect over the internet, and any slowdown or bottleneck along the way can slow down our data access to that. It's much more expensive, right? Not only do we have to look at paying the database licensing costs, you need your own physical hardware, we need all the firewall security, we need to pay probably a database administrator or somebody who can play both do both the hardware end as well as the software end of the administration. So that person's going to be on payroll making pretty good buck, right? We've got to take all of the security measures, we need backups, we need replication, we need all those things, maintenance. New operating system comes, we need hard drives die, like we're responsible for all of that stuff. But then again, all our data lives within our walls, right? If we're on another host, if that host gets compromised, now on a shared host, it's less secure because there's so many different people and applications that have access to that server. We could also still though rent a dedicated server. It's more expensive than shared, but we can have our own box, our own machine that no other applications use. So that's an option. That's kind of an intermediate option. We want our own server. We can afford a dedicated server, but it's still hosted somewhere else. It's still someone else's hardware and someone else that would pay the licensing costs.
So like recently the popularity of like Google servers, where they're like, I guess the term is instance, they're sharded servers, so they're all over the place. And basically, like if you have a target market, let's say in Asia, if your server is closer to Asia, they're going to load faster, right? Rather than like one in North America in your basement, something like that.
That's a good point.
Instead of paying thousands of dollars for an actual server with all the rates and stuff, couldn't you just build, like, say, a $2,000 computer that has the capabilities of running it and then virtualizing the server to VMware?
Yep, that is another that's made it much cheaper now, actually, is VMware, so that is another option for sure. That's sort of changed what many people do. I'm just going to show you. Here's a shared host. So I have a couple databases. Here are all of the databases on one server at this host. Now they've got dozens of servers. So this is one server. I have 2 or 3 of the databases on this server. Look how many other databases there are.
Do you have access to all of them?
No. I don't. They all have their own credentials. So right, I can try and open one of these. It's not going to let me. But the potential risk is if whoever builds that web application, I have no idea how secure that application is, right? If they leave a gaping security hole in their application, then potentially somebody could get into anything on here, right? So I wouldn't put anything like super mission critical on a shared host. If I was going to, I'd have my client pay for a dedicated server. But sometimes cost is a huge thing.
It's so hard to especially someone who doesn't realize the difference in the two. Like, how do you convince them to spend the extra $20, right? Like, you say, oh, $20 is not a big deal, but to them, someone who's penny pinching.
Yeah. Another option is that's above a dedicated server is a co-located server, where you buy the server. You buy the hardware, you pay the software license, it's your computer. But rather than running it in your office, a big hosting company will let you put it in there, so they're providing the connection and the backups and the physical security of the machine, but it's your computer. So you still have to pay for the computer. Like, they don't look after it, but they basically house it for you. And it's your machine lives in a big data center, and you could go and take it out.
Do you need to pay someone to admin it, or do you need,
Yes, so you still, they don't administer it, you administer your own, you go physically take your computer and install it on a rack in a data center. One of the big ones for this is located in Toronto. These guys, Pier 1. A number of the companies that I work with, so they do hosting and basically managed hosting. So they offer, but they also do co-location. So for example, I know the Globe and Mail, most of their servers are co-located at Pier 1. So physically they're Globe and Mails, at least they used to be. Their boxes that they own, they pay the licensing cost, but they put them here. So, and they supply the, the disaster recovery storage backup. It's quite expensive, but it's still probably, in many cases, better than having it within your own walls.
Would it really just be like a space issue thing that, like, to me, that doesn't?
Well, it's all the other things from a hardware perspective that you need, and also super fast connections to the servers that they're providing. Security, like nobody's going to walk in there and walk out with your server. Okay, or you're not going to have to worry about a disgruntled employee who gets fired, and at the end of the day comes and takes the server out of the server room when you're hosting in you have a co-located server in a place like this.
Do you have more personalization if you have your own server?
You have more personalization, but you're also responsible for doing updates, right? So let's say there's a security issue on Windows Server, right? If you're doing shared hosting, well, the hosting company is going to patch and keep that server up to date. If you have your own, it's up to you. It's your machine, so you have to have somebody who knows how to administer the machine, check for updates, keep it secure, things like that. They don't do this. They're just basically giving you a rack space and connectivity.
So are you biased on SQL Server and getting your own server?
Well, for me, I've never wanted my own server because I don't want the headache. And I'm a developer. I'm not a server administrator, right? So I don't know enough to know I could learn it, but it's really not where my interest lies. I'd rather just pay somebody else to do it. I'm not interested in really hosting. So I host things on shared servers, and I just mark up what the hosts charge me, but I leave it to the host to do.
You have multiple servers?
Yep, I use different hosts for different things.
Depends.
Yeah, it depends what it is, basically, and how critical it is.
Is it specific hosts that offer that, or any hosting site would offer SQL?
There are some hosts, like you've probably heard of HostGator, which is super cheap. Some hosts will only do Apache, so the only thing they offer is the LAMP stack, so PHP, Apache, MySQL. Probably that's about 50% of them out there. That's all you get. The other 50% will offer the LAMP stack and the Microsoft stack, which is ASP.NET and SQL Server. So basically you have a choice. The pricing generally is the same. Like if you go to a host that offers both, it will be the same regardless of whether you choose PHP or Microsoft.
Why would you get multiple hosts for different things? Why would you just get one?
Because one is a little cheaper, one is a little more expensive, but they have better support. So a couple of my more mission critical sites, I'm hosting on a more expensive host, but the tech support that they offer is better.
Also, yeah, the version control, like I had an issue, I was trying to run an application that was based in 5.5 PHP, and my usual host, they didn't have it, the tech support, they didn't know what that was apparently, so I had to get a different one. So that's
Okay.
cool.
Okay. So let's log into SQL Server, we'll look at Management Studio, we'll see some of the functionality that it offers. And then we'll also have to talk about how we're going to connect to it. So if you open up Management Studio, again, it's under Programs, Computer Studies, Microsoft SQL Server 2008 R2. Now, a lot of the functionality that's in this application, actually, Microsoft has added to Visual Studio. So many .NET developers nowadays, like whenever I'm working, I always have Visual Studio open and Management Studio open. I've done this for years and years and years. Many people now just work within Visual Studio. You can actually connect to your database, add tables, write queries. You can actually do all of that through Visual Studio. I'm kind of a Management Studio user. I've used it for years and years, so I like both, but I'll show you how you can also do it through Visual Studio. So I'll open up Management Studio. There's a lot of functionality here. We're not going to get into all of it. So if you're on the lab computers, here's how you connect. On the lab computer, your server name, so the first thing it wants to know is what server are you connecting to. On the lab computer, you choose localhost and then a backslash, not a forward slash, backslash ACPAC. ACPAC is accounting software that are installed on all the college computers. And the back end, the database that stores all the accounting data runs on SQL Server. So we can connect to that. And for authentication, if you're on a lab computer, just pick Windows authentication. It's set up, they set it up so long as you have a Windows network login, you can connect to SQL Server, which is kind of neat. So on the lab computer, this is all you have to do, and you can click connect. If you have your own instance of SQL Server running, for the server, you can just connect to, put in local, choose SQL Server authentication. Your username will be SA, and your password will be whatever password you put in when you installed SQL Server and you made a note of your password so you didn't forget it. And you can click connect. And there's none of that annoying store in vault pop-up that MySQL Workbench gives you that you may hate as much. Well, you couldn't possibly hate as much as I hate.
No, what annoyed me about Workbench was halfway through like the final, I had to close and reopen. Well, my program crashed 5 times in 5 minutes.
One of the other things he mentioned about SQL Server, it's a very mature product. Like this has been around. I remember I was using SQL Server, it's been around since the 90s. I remember it was a big deal when they came out with SQL Server 2000. Before that there was version 7, version 6. So this has been around for a long time. It's very stable, it's very well established, and it's been kind of evolved over many, many years. So here's what we get. So we've got management. We're not really going to play around here. So we can set up security, logging. We can generate mail if we want to send email straight out of our database, which is kind of neat. Replication is a neat feature. This is for database synchronization. So I actually had a student the other day who's building, he's in one of my other classes, he's building an ASP.NET application, and he said, I need my users, like I have users being out working and they need to collect data, but they're not going to have an internet connection where they are. How can I get them to store the data locally, and then as soon as they have an internet connection, how can we get it to sync? Well, that's what this replication function is. So somebody can have a local copy of the database, and when they have an internet connection, it can automatically sync to a master copy. So if they add changes or add new data locally, they can sync it. Replication also allows us to sync between servers. Vadim talked about Google having clusters of servers, right? So we can run the copies of the same database on multiple servers. So if one goes down, we have it running on a server farm in a cluster, and we can be syncing between. So that's what replication is. Sort of a very advanced concept. We're not going to do it in the course, but this kind of functionality is built in. Sorry? Okay, I guess just a different install option perhaps on the computers.
Yeah.
So we can do everything with security, set up logins, do roles and permissions. So we can set up different users, that, like some that might have read-only access to our database, some that have administrator access. We can set up cryptography for doing encryption. We're really not going to play around in here, but this is some of the functionality that's here. So then we go to our databases. So if you're on a lab computer and you click databases, you'll get a bunch of accounting databases. If you're on your local one, it'll be pretty much empty. So we'll create a new database. I'll show you how you can create a table and just show you how SQL Server works. I have a script on Blackboard later that will build out kind of a bigger database, but I'll show you how we would start from scratch. So if you just click on databases, if you right click, new database. I'll just call my database Friday. We're not going to wind up keeping this one. This is just a quick demo so we can get used to the interface. So what actually will get created are two files. And here's the default path: program files, SQL Server, MS SQL, and eventually there is a folder in here called data. So this will create two files: an MDF file, which is the actual database file itself, and an LDF file, which is a log file. So that's where it's going to create. We'll just let it create them in the default space. So it'll create a database called Friday. So within here, mostly we'll work with tables and views. Views are basically queries. So let's say we've written a query that we want to run regularly. We can create it as a view, and that way that SQL query is stored right in the database. And we can just open it and execute that query anytime. There's also things, again, advanced concepts, things like functions or triggers. So triggers are things like if there's something we want to do before we save a new record to a table, we want that code to run every time, we can store it in here. So we'll just go and we'll build a new table. So all I'm going to do, we don't actually have to write any SQL to do this. There's like a visual designer, we can build a table this way. For years and years, I never actually wrote. When I started teaching relational database, I actually had to relearn how to create table statements, because I'd used this for years where I never actually wrote the SQL. So just right click on table, say new table. So we'll put a few columns in. Let's see, what will we call this? I'll put in a column. I'll call it customer ID, which will be an integer. We don't want it to be null. To make this a primary key, right here on the toolbar, here's a button, set primary key. Well, that's good. And I'm just going to pull this up so we can see the properties. I'm going to scroll down here in the bottom in the property section. It says identity specification. It defaults to no. About halfway down. I'm going to click the plus sign here beside identity specification. And it says, is identity no? I'll just toggle that to yes. And identity seed, meaning where do we want to start the numbers at? Let's say we don't want our first record to be 1. We want our first record to be, let's say, 4,000. I'll just change the identity seed value to 4,000. So our first record will start at 4,000.
Where's column properties?
It's this section at the bottom here. You've got the column names here. It's this panel in the bottom half of the page are the column properties, right there at the bottom of your screen, Ori. So I'll add a couple more columns. We'll add first name, which will make a varchar, and last name, which can also be a varchar. So I'm going to uncheck allow nulls. Now notice my naming convention. Here's one of the other great things about SQL Server. It's not case sensitive. Okay? So why did I use this naming convention? And when we did a MySQL database, I said name everything lowercase was a good idea. Doesn't really matter with SQL Server because our SQL commands and our table names and our column names, they're not case sensitive. This is the typical Microsoft naming convention. You don't have to use that format. You can use all lowercase. You can name things any way you want. Typically in the Microsoft, all the code samples you'll see, typically in the database, they'll write all the object names in camel case, and they'll prefix the first letter of the table names and column names. You don't have to follow that convention. That's kind of what I'm used to, so I'm going to use that style. nchar, it's just a different type of character data. Sorry? Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, you can use that. It's really, the difference is just semantic. It's not going to affect anything. If you leave it at that, it's fine.
Mine, like I did customer name and it's in brackets. Like it automatically created it in brackets in the column name. I see yours does not have.
Did you put a space in it?
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
that's what it goes.
If there's a space in the name, it will represent it because so that it's one field. If I take the space out. Okay. So I'm just going to so to save my table, I can just click Save on the toolbar, and I'll just call my table Customers. So that's a little easier than writing a create table statement. We're less likely to mess it up. Now, certainly we can still write the SQL commands, but I find this is faster. I can get my database built much more quickly through this visual editor.
Now, if you have an error in your table, SQL Workbench, it'll tell you the error at the bottom, but it'll let you figure out where it is. In Visual Studio, where it says like, here's where you're missing like an expected whatever
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah, we'll look at that. So we'll look at so we have a couple ways. We'll put a couple records in here, and I'll show you two different ways to do it, and then we'll get to that question.
Is this generating the code as well? Can you see the code?
Okay, great question. Yes, if you want to see the code, here's how we could do it. If I right-click on my table, I can say script table as. So let's say you want to build this table, but you want the script. I can say create to new query editor window, or I could send it to the clipboard or to a file if I want to save it. There's the script. In fact, the database that I'm going to give you that we're going to build, this is exactly what I did. I built it through the visual editor, 4 tables, the same way you guys did, and then I just exported it to a script, and I've put the script on Blackboard. So after the break, you guys will grab that script and we can just run it. Okay. So it writes a whole bunch of, options, but here's their basic create table statement.
So pretty much they'll type them for your channel.
Yeah, if you prefer writing the script yourself, if we wanted to create a table, you just click on New Query, and then this is like the Workbench query window, right? So I could create table, product, etc. It works the same way. Okay. Now, the SQL is about 95% the same between SQL Server and MySQL. There are a few small differences. Okay, there are a few commands that are different. The Microsoft version, they call their version Transact SQL or TSQL. So if you click on Help and I opened up the Help, it would say TSQL Help. Here's one of the differences. Let's say in MySQL, so I can put in a comment, so MySQL version. If we wanted to get, let's say, the first 2 customer records, how would we do it? What would the command be in a MySQL database?
Select.
and it would have to be case sensitive if it was MySQL, how would you get just the first 2 records? And say limit 2, right? That would give you the first 2. The SQL Server equivalent would be this. Notice we also get the code prompts just like we do in Visual Studio, which is nice. Okay, and Mackenzie, in answer to your question, just like in Visual Studio, it underlines it because it doesn't like the syntax. Okay. One of the other nice things, I'll show you a couple other things the query editor does. We'll take a break in a minute. Okay. We can actually get our syntax to be checked before we execute it. So this little blue button says check all of the SQL for errors. If I click parse, the queries won't actually run. So let's say I want to run an insert, but I want to check the syntax before I actually run it. If I click parse, it'll tell me on line 2 there's incorrect syntax here. And again, you can, so if I click just like in Workbench, if I click execute, it will execute everything. If I highlight one or more commands and click execute, it just runs that command only. Right? So this one will generate an error if I execute it. This one won't. So if we want to add some test data here, again, we can either do it we can do it here, or we can do it right through the visual interface. We'll add 2 records, one through the Visual Designer and one through SQL, then we'll take a break. So if I want to add it directly to the table, if I right-click my table, I should be able to do it if I say select top 1,000 rows. Actually, maybe I'm not going to be able to do it in this version. Yeah, you know what? In some of the versions, there's an option here that says show table data, and I can just type the values in. So I guess we'll have to insert them, which is okay. So I'll close that. So our insert is basically the same. We'll insert into customers. Insert just 2 names, doesn't matter. Whoops, should be. So we'll just add a couple records. So I can just add those 2 records and it'll tell me my query ran and affected. Just click on New Query right here. So you can open multiple query windows. Actually, I'll show you one other feature, then we'll take a break. I promise. If I run my select query now, we get 2 records. Bottom. So this is very similar to Workbench. Pretty similar to what you're already used to seeing. But totally not case sensitive. If I want to write customers all in uppercase, SQL Server doesn't care. So in MySQL, you could have 2 customers tables, one all caps, one all lowercase, and it would treat them as 2 separate objects. Just like on the Windows file system, Microsoft SQL Server is going to treat those as the same object. So just make sure you add a couple records in there. I don't care what the names say. Oops. Actually, once you have your query running, we'll just take a break here. Okay, it's time. Does anybody have any other questions so far about SQL Server?
And then,
There, to run your query, just click the execute button.
right. Oh, yeah. In Workbench, we always had to use another host or server at the very top. Do we need that?
Good question.
I guess not.
Well, you don't need to use, but notice here, I'm connected to my Friday database. When you first open it up, you can pick, once you've connected, this shows you all of the databases. So you might just want to pick, you need to pick from the drop down, but you don't actually have to type a used command, no. Do it, choosing your database here, in effect, runs the use command for you. That's a good question. But you don't actually need to type that SQL command anymore in SQL Server. Just choose the database. So it's much more of a visual interface. Many of the things you have to do in code in MySQL Workbench, you don't have to, you can just kind of click here. But it's probably better that you've already learned to do this stuff manually in Workbench, so you know how to do stuff manually, and now this is saving you time with shortcuts.
Sir, how did you access the results page?
Just new query.
But mine just has messages. It has one row selected, one row selected, but it doesn't.
Okay, because you just ran the insert?
Yeah.
When you run the insert, if you don't run a select, the results tab doesn't show up.
Oh.
It will show up when you run a select statement.
Gotcha.
So you won't see this results tab when you do your insert. You'll just see the messages. But you'll see the results once you run your select query. I think you guys don't see the line numbers. I think by default that option is not enabled, which drives me crazy.
Yeah.
Particularly because if we get an error, the error message includes the line number. So you can turn the line numbers on, just like in Visual Studio. I think it's under Tools and Options. So under Tools, Options, if you open up the text editor section here and click on Transact SQL, which I have highlighted in blue, there is a line number checkbox right here. So text editor, Transact SQL, you can check off line numbers, and then that will give you the line numbers to the left of your query window. So it might be a good idea to turn that on. It makes life a little bit easier. If you're on your own machine, once you turn that option on, it will be on every time moving forward. You won't have to keep enabling it. So, Kaylee, coming back to your question from a few weeks ago, this is where just running it only on a Mac with Code Visual Studio breaks down, because you can run Visual Studio on another on Linux or Mac. You can't run this. I will have a look.